Иногда подобные вещи именуют историческими исследованиями, иногда альтернативной точкой зрения. А это просто зараза, инфекция, вранье и деза. Дезинформация запускается осмысленно специально обученными и знающими, как все было на самом деле людьми. А дальше деза обрастает плотью, мясом, шерстью. Ее воспроизводят телевизионные комментаторы, скороспелые публицисты и видеоблогеры. Она заползает в псевдоисторическую беллетристику и в художественные фильмы, а следом и в школьные программы. Противостоять этому сложно, противостоять этому почти невозможно, но выбора у нас нет. Те, кто были до нас, в самом прямом смысле умирали за правду, за свободу и за справедливость. А сейчас настали такие дни, что мы начинаем пугаться голос возвысить. А вдруг нас неправильно поймут? Кто нас поймет неправильно? Люди, готовящие очередную дезу, или те, кто этой заразой питается? Первые все и так понимают, они на войне, а со вторыми надо разговаривать. Спокойно, терпеливо, не торопясь, исключительно языком фактов.
Myth number 1. 1941 to 1945 saw a civil war in Russia. Russians had never before gone over to the enemy, and this happened nowhere else in the world. In 1941, the army ran away. It did not want to fight for the bloody Soviet regime. Yes, the Germans reached Moscow and Stalingrad. In 1941, they took 4 million Soviet soldiers captive.
Давайте! Всякое сопротивление бессмысленно! Давайте!
The Nazi side counted 1.3 million people in various military formations. Half of them were those who had left territories annexed between 1939 and 1941. The Baltics, Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, Moldova, and emigrants. These figures are well known, and no one tries to deny them. Now let us ask ourselves a simple and unpleasant question. Has such a thing ever happened before in Russia? Yes, on multiple occasions. A vast country that is constantly expanding, that contains with it dozens of ethnic groups, and experiences severe economic crises, will always have a great many enemies. Naturally, within such a family, there will always be someone easily cowed and prepared to accept another's terms. In the Northern War under Peter the Great, Ivan Mazepa and his troops went over to the Swedes. In the Crimean War, thousands of Crimean Tatars went over to the British, French, and Turks. In the Caucasus, people expected liberators to arrive, and many mountaineers fought against the Russians. During Napoleon's campaign, in just a few months, the Catholic gentry of Lithuania and Belarus gathered a force of 20,000 men who were fighting against Russia together with all enlightened Europe. But now, just compare this to the scale of the conflicts. In the Russian, Swedish, and Crimean wars, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of men took part, and in World War II, it was in the millions. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, but their troops remained in their places. They had plenty of time to prepare for the German offensive, which began in Denmark and Norway on April 9th, and France and Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands on May 10, 1940. Nevertheless, by July, it was all over. 6 European countries had surrendered, and the British barely managed to scramble back to their island. Germany's losses were 50,000 men. The Allies lost 100,000, and here we must note that over 2 million men were taken prisoner. As for the Red Army, which supposedly did not want to fight and sought to surrender. Unlike the other nations from June to December 1941, it had managed to kill 400,000 Germans and their allies. You see the difference. Does that mean that the bloody tyrant Stalin ruled France too in 1940, and the French did not want to defend him? Now let us turn to collaboration with Hitler among those nations of civilized Europe which had never known Soviet despotism. France. Some 134,000 people in the Alsace and Lorraine region, which was incorporated into Germany, were drafted into the Wehrmacht and fought for Hitler. They fought mainly on the Eastern Front, against you and me. Moreover, 20,000 Frenchmen volunteered for the Wehrmacht and other paramilitary formations, including the SS division Charlemagne, and another 300,000 served Marshal Petain's pro-Nazi puppet regime. At least 5,000 French died in fighting against the British and Americans in Syria, Lebanon, Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Madagascar. In addition, about 200 French policemen, fascist militants, and other groups were hunting for members of the underground, including Russians from among the escaped prisoners of war and immigrants who belonged to the resistance. All in all, 600,000 French people who were on Hitler's side against a total French population of 115 million people. 600,000, you understand. And this was despite the fact that they had not been through a recent civil war. They saw no Basmachi movement, no Skoropadsky or Petlura, no collectivization, and no harsh pre-war purges. The Wehrmacht, police, and the SS counted 500,000 residents of the Second Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth against a total Polish population of 30 million. Of the 25 million Belgians, Dutch, Luxembourgers, Danes, and Norwegians, the Nazis recruited over 200,000 for police, SS, and other roles. Did Luxembourg and the Netherlands too have a civil war, and did Bolshevik cruelty rage there? But why doesn't anyone ever talk about this? Now we come to the main difference between us and all the European countries taken together. In our country, together with the militants and partisans, 36 million people fought against Hitler, representing every ethnicity within the USSR. We wiped out 3/4 of the German divisions, while all the other countries together defeated just the remaining quarter. Do you understand? There's no comparison. None at all. We have nothing to be ashamed of. Man is weak, but we have transcended the weaknesses of some of our compatriots many times over in battles that were unparalleled. Yet, many people from the other side, though certainly not all, attempt to distract from their weakness by disseminating lies and battling against Soviet military monuments. They do this boldly and have no equals in that. Myth number 2. Stalin, horrified at the outbreak of the war, fled to his dacha. The writer Anatoly Rybakov even wrote about this in his novel The Children of the Arbat, which was translated into dozens of languages and printed in over 80 million copies worldwide. What are we to make of this claim? Stalin's agenda tells us that on June 22, 1941, already at 5:45 a.m., Molotov, Beria, Timoshenko, Mechlis, and Zhukov had already arrived to meet with Stalin. Timoshenko, Mechlis, and Zhukov left at 8:30 a.m., Beria at 9:20 a.m., Molotov at 12:05 p.m. Meanwhile, Malenkov and Vyshinsky had come at 7:30 a.m., Mikoyan at 7:55 a.m., and Kaganovich and Voroshilov at 8 a.m. For 11 hours, Meetings were held uninterruptedly with representatives of all state ministries. What dacha? Where was Stalin horrified? Why all this talk?
Первая группа в количестве 9 самолетов, двухмоторных.
During the first 2 weeks of the war, Stalin had one break from meetings for 1 day and another break for 2 days. But this was because everyone had already received their orders, and the government apparatus was running in overdrive.
Обстановка, товарищ народный комиссар, следующая. Противник направил на Москву 54 самолета. Из них 3 удалось прорваться к городу. Остальные были встречены нашими истребителями.
We know less about how the state apparatus functioned under similar circumstances in France, Belgium, or Poland. Historians do not know all about that, but no one is writing books about it or shooting films. One would think that everything was just fine there, unlike in our country. Myth number 3, the Siege of Leningrad. According to the reasoning of a well-known writer in Russia, Leningrad could have been left alone. Another author wrote a whole article, granted for the German press, about how both Hitler and Stalin destroyed the city together, almost as if there were a pact between them. Another popular lady writer said on a radio program, and we quote, "The French were great. They saved their people. They saved their city of Paris. Not like us, supposedly barbarians. Now, if we had just surrendered, everything would have worked out fine. The Leningraders would have survived. Leningrad would not have been bombarded." They talk about this here in Russia. They talk about it abroad. Should we respond to this somehow? Do we have the right? I think someone already has. General Franz Halder, Chief of Staff of the Nazi High Command, wrote on July 8, 1941, "The Führer is firmly determined to level Moscow and Leningrad to the ground and to dispose fully of their population, which otherwise we shall have to feed during the winter." General Alfred Jodl, Wehrmacht commander, wrote, "The surrender of Leningrad and subsequently Moscow should not be accepted, even if the enemy offers it." The Bulletin of the Northern Fighting Group records, "The senior infantry commander has proposed laying mines at the front lines, so forces will not have to enter into fighting directly with the civilian population." Do you see? They were confident that the Soviet soldiers would surrender, while the local civilian population, which was completely surrounded by minefields, would simply die out. If Leningrad were taken and the Soviet forces there were destroyed, then at least 20 German divisions would have been freed up for a subsequent attack on Moscow, including 2 tank divisions. Their arrival at Moscow could have led to the fall of the capital. We could have lost the war. Do you understand? Myth number 4. It is strange that the very same minds, both Russian and foreign, who think it would have been reasonable to just surrender Leningrad, love to talk about the crushing defeats the Red Army suffered in the first period of the war. If you listen to them, then you would think that in the summer and autumn of 1941, the USSR did nothing but lose. In fact, in the Arctic, the Germans were unable to seize Murmansk. The Germans and Finns' attempt to cut off the Kirov Railway after taking Kandalaksha and Louhi also failed. In October, the Nazi enemy's progress was decisively halted. It is significant that the same 2nd and 3rd Mountain Divisions, which in 1940 had seized Norway at lightning speed, were unable to take Murmansk. On July 21st, the 22nd Soviet Army liberated Velikiye Luki and held on to it until August 25th. General Franz Halder, Chief of Staff of the Nazi High Command, wrote on July 22nd, After we were unable to encircle the enemy in the Nevel region and we were forced to retreat from Velikie Luki, our chances of a successful operation, which could have resulted in crushing superiority on our side, were greatly reduced. On August 3rd, he wrote, "There can no longer be talk of any offensive in this sector. We are forced to go on the defensive." The heroic defense of Odessa is yet another story. Soviet forces held the city from August 5th until October 16th and warded off every attack by Romania's Fourth Army. Our losses were 40,000, including 14,000 killed or captured. The enemy's losses were 92,000, including 29,000 killed or captured. The city was abandoned by orders from command so that it could be reinforced by the Sevastopol garrison. The evacuation was carried out surreptitiously without the enemy noticing. The Romanian army's main forces were directed to the rear so they could be reformed. As the head of the German army mission in Romania, General Arthur Haufe admitted, the Russian forces in Odessa had played their role and won time. They managed to delay for 2 months our plans to turn Odessa into a base for supplies. Even in the first months of the war, with all the well-known defeats and even disasters, we still fought better. Once again, we proved superior to all the other European armies dealing with Hitler. Myth number 5. By not signing the Geneva Convention, it was Stalin who doomed millions of Soviet prisoners of war to death. Regardless of whether the USSR was or was not a signatory to the Geneva Convention, Germany did sign it, including Articles 4 and 82, which state the detaining power is required to take care of all prisoners of war that it captures. The provisions of the present convention shall be respected by the high contracting parties in all circumstances. In time of war, if one of the belligerents is not a party to the convention, its provisions shall, nevertheless, remain binding as between the belligerents who are parties thereto. Therefore, the blame for the deaths in captivity of 3 million Soviet POWs and persons considered POWs, mainly party functionaries, lies solely on Germany and the countries in league with it. They cannot deny it. From a German order on how to treat Soviet POWs, dated September 8, 1941, Bolshevism is the mortal enemy of National Socialist Germany. For the first time, German soldiers are facing a foe who is not only trained militarily, but also schooled politically in the destructive spirit of Bolshevism. The struggle against National Socialism is in the enemy's blood. He will wage it with every means available: sabotage, propaganda, arson, murder. Therefore, a Bolshevist soldier has lost all entitlement to treatment as an honest soldier in accordance with the Geneva Convention.
Вот руины военного госпиталя.
Я гвардии старший сержант Коробкин Павел Андреевич, раненый лежал в этом корпусе. Вот моя койка, где я лежал. Меня спасла Лидия Петровна Демочкина. Остальные товарищи, бойцы командиры, которые со мной лежали, вот перед моими глазами лежат обгоревшие трупы.
It thus hardly matters whether Stalin signed the Geneva Convention or not. We must remember that the Germans and their allies killed a total of 13 million peaceful civilians in the USSR. Was failing to sign the Geneva Convention the reason that whole villages in Belarus were burned, together with their inhabitants? Myth number 6. In order to somehow compensate for what the Nazi invaders carried out in the USSR, atrocities which were without parallel in all history, a myth was created that Soviet soldiers entering Germany raped 1 million German women. Rather, the figure of 1 million was used at first, but in their 1992 book, Befreier und Befreite, The German scholars and feminists Helke Sander and Barbara Johr cited a figure more than twice as high. Let's examine the proof they adduced, which has been analyzed by the historian Igor Petrov. Mathematicians, take heed. Sander and Johr rely on the statistics on births at Berlin's Augusta Victoria Klinikum. Of the 804 children born between September 1st, 1945 and December 31st, 1946, 34 of them are ascribed a Russian parent. Consequently, 4.2% of children were born to Russians. Later, these percentages are rounded to the nearest 5. Curious indeed. And here, some real juggling of the figures begins. A masterful display. From somewhere, they get the claim that only 10% of raped women gave birth. Therefore, the figure they came up with has to be multiplied by 10. And what do you make of the claim that only 1 out of 20 women can get pregnant from rape? From a scientific perspective, this is complete nonsense, but that doesn't seem to bother anyone. Thus, we arrive at 57,800 women raped in Berlin alone. But these are just women aged 18 to 45. If we include females aged 14 to 18 and 45 to 70, then we end up with a completely insane figure: 73,300 girls and old women. They then make a final effort to expand this to Germany as a whole. The numbers now are staggering: 2.62 million women raped. Mathematical sleight of hand, that's all it is. Of course, there was some incident of rape. Among the millions of Soviet soldiers entering Germany were men who had lost their homes, their families, and many of their comrades. On our side, we don't even count how many Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Jewish girls were raped. Rather, we count the numbers of people killed, tortured, and burned alive. In fact, we don't even have to justify ourselves or explain ourselves, but we'll do it anyway. The statistics presented by the study's authors, in fact, divide the Russian children of the occupation into Russian with a question mark, that is, possibly Russian, and Russian from rape. The number of the latter births is found to be only 9 out of 34. Consequently, all the rest of their calculations are rendered meaningless. You could equally well take the records from Berlin's Augusta Victoria Klinikum and add up all the babies born in 1945 and 1946 to Americans, British, and French, and end up with a number of 13 births. Then, on those grounds, you could prove that the other Allies assaulted 50,126 women and girls in Berlin, and all across Germany, 2.52 million women. Of course, no one is writing books about that. Perhaps you are wondering why. We are wondering why too, but we can take a guess. In any event, we must recall that in World War II, the Americans, for example, lost 12,100 civilians, which is 1,132 times less than we lost. Their cities, villages, and farms were not reduced to dust and ashes. Their livestock were not plundered and eaten. Their property was not stolen. And yet, the same unpleasant statistics apply to the Americans as well. Let us cite just one fact which puts all this German research on the subject into doubt. If we take a clear look at things, the peak of rapes in Berlin should have come in April and May 1945, and so we should expect a peak of Russian babies born in January and February 1946. Yet, at Berlin's Augusta Victoria Klinikum, a larger percentage of Russian babies were born in 1945 than in 1946. How could any Russian babies have been born in September and October? There is simply no way, though they were claimed to have been born. If more of them were born in the fall of 1945 than in early 1946, we ought to do a complete recount because we are clearly dealing with a crude manipulation of facts. Myth number 7. All Red Army soldiers liberated from POW camps were sent to gulags, or punitive battalions. Even in the movie The Brest Fortress, it is said that the fortress's heroic defender, Pyotr Gavrilov, faced retaliations after he was rescued from a POW camp. Let us tell it as it really happened. By March 1st, 1946, 1,539,475 former POWs had been repatriated. That includes collaborators with the Germans who had fled to the British and American zones and were sent back from there. Of these, 226,127 were handed over to the NKVD. Thus, less than 15% of former POWs were handed over to the NKVD. While Pyotr Gavrilov did wind up in a camp, it was because he was appointed to head a Siberian camp for Japanese POWs, something which the Brest Fortress movie preferred to pass over. If we, in the former USSR, are fooling ourselves, then what can we expect from others? Let us say it again. If we cannot be honest with ourselves, if we lie about our own past, then what can we expect from others?